Thanks very much for having me. And yeah, great to speak at the Pittsburgh user group. I was in Pittsburgh around 3 weeks ago. I'm actually UK based. And so, yeah, my name's Peter Clisby. I'm Sitecore Content Hub Architect at SoftServe. And my talk today is going to be around Content Hub, Web Client SDK, internal and external integrations. Um, so yeah, as I say, I've recently come back from a month in the US. I was in Nashville for 3 weeks and then drove up to Pittsburgh. And I really recommend Nashville for anyone looking to go symposium, and definitely have Prince's hot chicken if you do. So agenda for today. I'm going to start by just quickly talking about Content Hub, a couple of the main modules of DAM and CMP. Then I'm going to just give an overview of the Web Client SDK and then move into kind of internal versus external integrations and what I mean by that. Then as part of the internal integrations, I'm going to look at triggers, actions, and scripts. And then for the external integrations, I'm going to primarily focus on APIs and function apps, but then also touch on the connector, or the Sitecore connector for Content Hub. And then I'm going to touch very briefly on Experience Edge as a sort of comparison to building an API in the Web Client SDK in C#. And then give some examples of APIs, function apps, and and connectors. Okay, so you can see here the kind of manage tab for Content Hub. Anyone who's worked with Content Hub will be familiar with it. And three very common kind of things you'll work with when using Content Hub are code features that are internal to the platform. And this is what I mentioned around kind of actions and scripts, and then external components. I'm not going to talk about external components today, because they're built in React or previously in Knockout.js, and my talk is around the Web Client SDK. I'm also external code integrations, so connectors, as I've said about the Sitecore connector, but in theory that applies to any connector. Building APIs with the Web Client SDK, Azure Functions, and then lots more options. And then a big part of Content Hub, I think, which I'm not going to touch so much on today, is the kind of schema and page configuration, and the things I list there, making that up. Okay, so Content Hub DAM, and for anyone not familiar, DAM is digital asset management. And for me, with Content Hub, what you're really trying to do is build a e-commerce search experience for marketers and content editors, so that they're able to find their assets really quickly. In the same way as with Amazon or any sort of good e-commerce experience, you're going to find what you're looking for really quickly. And in the case of Content Hub DAM, you're trying to create that experience that that marketers are able to find exactly what they want very quickly, also identify where there's duplicates, lots of other good features. And then CMP is another, what I would say is the second biggest module in Content Hub. I think DAM is the original kind of use case for it, and CMP is content marketing platform. And in a similar way to sort of managing digital assets, you're almost building a great experience for editors, but also creating that kind of breaking down silos, so you've got a unified place for enterprise content in the same way as you need for your enterprise digital assets. Content marketing platform is building that content that is going to be enterprise level. If you've got multiple CMSs, for example, if you've got even multiple tenants within a CMS, that content becomes almost editable in one place and manageable in one place. But the main focus of my talk is the Web Client SDK. And the documentation, I find that with Content Hub as a whole, it's almost at times too good in that it's very verbose, but it's very thorough on the Web Client SDK. There's also an example repo that this is probably a little bit old now, but when I was first learning Content Hub, I got lots out of it, and it's got lots of examples of things that you might need if you're developing with Content Hub. So some of the things I love about the Web Client SDK is it makes me feel like I'm a .NET developer again. It's written in C#. You can consume it via a Nuget package from any solution that supports C#. And it's the same SDK for writing scripts within Content Hub as it is for the external integrations that you might use the Nuget package for. And I've mentioned the comprehensive documentation. You've also, within the SDK, you've got lots of interfaces for various entity types, as you can see on the right-hand side here, asset entities, file entities, various other things. So there's lots of utility kind of methods and features within the SDK. And then I've touched on previously the concept of internal versus external integrations with both Content Hub and the Web Client SDK. And internally, the big one, or if not the only one, is action scripts. Now, there's C# that gets compiled into the platform in a kind of low-code UI. The actions are fired based on triggers that are configured with conditions. We'll look at that briefly later. These triggers support both in process and running in the background. So the in process are kind of render blocking. They're going to actually stop any further interaction until they're completed. And then obviously the background processes are running asynchronously and enabling the UI to carry on with what it was doing. Now, these triggers are based around 3 criteria: creation, modification, and deletion. And in that way, you can configure these triggers for various different use cases, and then they can fire your action scripts. And within the web client, with the Web Client SDK, you can then do lots of powerful things. And then the external integrations, you can use them for APIs, the connectors, as I've mentioned, Azure functions, any technology supporting C#. And then, in theory, any technology can integrate direct with the REST API, or there are other SDKs. But in order to use the Web Client SDK, you need to support C#. So moving in to touch briefly on actions, scripts, and triggers. For people that have worked with Content Hub, this will probably not be news. But looking at some triggers here and some examples. So you can configure conditions within them. You can see where you're setting the entity type, and in this masset draft creation, we're looking at masset. Excuse me. And then my condition here, you can see I'm looking for the relation asset to draft asset, and when that's not empty. So to give a bit of background information for that, why you might want to use a draft in Content Hub is if you've got an asset that's gone through the state flow or the workflow, it's been submitted for approval and approved by someone with those permissions. But then if you are someone that doesn't have those permissions to approve live content, and you want to edit something that's already live, you can create a draft of that asset, go and edit it freely as you want, and then you can submit that back through a workflow or a state flow, and in which case that draft, once approved, would get merged with the original asset and effectively become the original asset. So in this way, if you wanted to perform some action in your script, with your C#, this trigger can fire that script based on when a draft is created. And then more simple ones, you can see on the bottom left here, the kind of state flow changing. So if the value was ready to publish or publish, you may then fire a trigger or fire something. So this might be used, for example, if you're using a connector in perhaps the Sitecore connector. And so if you want to be pushing, for example, to a service bus when changes are made to something that is in either ready to publish or published, this trigger would enable that. And then on the top right here, you can see a really simple example of where the entity is M content, which are CMP content, and where the content's content type is a blog. And in that case, you could configure that to be on creation, modification, or deletion, and then do something very specific for blogs. So finally, on the bottom right here, you've just got the content approval example, where again it's on M content, and we're looking where the proof for creation is true, and then we're looking at the content types being any of the out of the box CMP content types, either a blog, a story, or a news entity. And again, you can then fire your various actions accordingly. So that's a good segue to the actions. You can see a couple of examples here where we've got a action script, and this can then fire your Web Client SDK C# script. There's also other examples you can see, like start state machine. There is making an API call. And here you can put in the URL of the API you want to call, the sort of HTTP verb of the method, and you can also parameterize that with headers or values. And if you want a fixed value, you can just put your fixed value here. But if you want a kind of dynamic value to come from the target entity, you can put the member name you want to populate that into sort of squiggly brackets, and it might be the identifier, the title, whatever you can think, will then get populated. So additionally, with actions, you've got the option of an Azure service bus, and this is you're able to put your connection string, put your topic, and the topic name as the destination. In a similar way, you can populate values. I looked at the headers previously, but same concept if you want to populate with, for example, the title. And you can see on the right-hand side here what comes through with the service bus message is in if you're doing it on modification, you'll get this save entity message. If you're doing it on deletion, I think it's a delete entity message. And then I think a create entity message if it's created. But in the case of the modification with the save entity message, you've got these property changes that show you what's changed, and you can act accordingly. But we'll come back to see how the service bus does relate, or I'll loop back to see relate that to the Web Client SDK subsequently. But within your scripts, you can do lots of kind of utility things within Content Hub. So a really common example is configuring AD groups to map to Content Hub user groups. So if you're you can configure SSO with Content Hub really simply. It's just sort of filling in various values into settings. But you can take that a step further if you want to actually have within Active Directory be having groups where you're using this syntax up the top here, where you're getting the claims where the type is groups. And then effectively you can then map that to Content Hub user group. So and then that means rather than be kind of managing that within the platform, it means you can manage that from an organization level to actually configure people's permissions within Active Directory, and then that just propagates over Content Hub. So you can also see the kind of low code UI and how that gets compiled into the platform, where you've got this kind of build and you're getting this build output to say if you've got an error in your C#, or and you can see an example on the right hand side here. And then as well as that, you can configure things like the log level. So if you want sort of verbose logging in your auditing, you can configure that at a script level. And then something that's a really common thing that I find with using the Web Client SDK in scripts is where a member might not be loaded before you need to use it. So you can see here, and I showed in the previous example of one of the triggers where I was looking at the asset to draft asset. So you can see this syntax here, this load member async is a way to ensure that you're waiting for that member to be loaded, because in some cases you can do this get relation async, and then effectively you end up getting an error where for whatever reason that hasn't loaded. And so I think that's an important thing to note, is waiting for them to load using this method, and then you can ensure it functions as you intend. And so on the right hand side here, you can see another common example, and I think this is an out of the box one, where it's creating public links for linked assets to CMP entities. And so if you think about that, if you've got a CMP item, a content item that you're publishing, if that's referencing an asset that doesn't have a public link, obviously when you push that to the downstream system, say for example Sitecore XM, you'd have an asset in the content that would have no public link to show on the front end. So that's the type of thing that these scripts come very much in handy for. You can see the kind of, we'll look at this in more detail subsequently, but you can see this query here where it's kind of looking for, does the preview or download original public link already exist for this asset. And then as it goes down, it effectively creates the public asset with this create for rendition, calling this create for rendition method. And whilst you can't reference other classes so easy in the script, you can create functions, as you can see here, this create for rendition asynchronous function or method, and then we're calling that for awaiting create for rendition preview public link with the asset ID being sent through. And so, as I say, there could be 100 different things you want to achieve with these scripts. It could be something that's I've seen in use commonly is creating public links when content is approved. And if say, for example, you've got 5 or 6 renditions that are the key renditions that users should be able to select, then you're always going to want them. So a variation of this script would be on publishing an asset, and this is where linking back to the trigger concept, where perhaps if the state flow had changed to being in the approved state, you could then trigger that script and run the script to basically go and create public links for all of the renditions that are important for your assets to have. So it's that kind of utility method within the platform. You're able to use the Web Client SDK to achieve lots of different things. Now, it's worth noting in the scripting, and actually before we move on, it's worth noting in the scripting there are some limitations. You used to be able to use like an HTTP client. You used to be able to use sort of foundational .NET libraries for sort of IO and like Stream Reader, for example, and they've locked that down. So I guess for performance reasons, I can imagine a lot of people maybe abuse that functionality. So there are some limitations now that you can't do that type of thing. You couldn't make an API request from your script, from your action script, because the HTTP client is not allowed.
So that's worth noting. Now, if you want to debug your scripts, a lot of the time, for me, I'm lazy, and you can get a long way by just enabling logging and kind of blindly debugging that way. But I mentioned before this Visual Studio solution example repo, um, and within that they've got a sample script where they kind of show how you can debug that locally. There's some instructions around configuring that to work with your Content Hub instance, and you need to configure a few things in order for it to work. But that's a good way if you're not if you really can't figure out what's going on in the script. That's a good way to debug it, and you get that full kind of debug experience in Visual Studio, and then you can see, at a granular level exactly what's going wrong and how to fix it. So I think that's a good feature to be aware of, and you can see here it's the same. It's exactly the same syntax, and the IDE is supporting that. Okay, so moving into if you were wanted to build an API for Content Hub. Now, something I've often seen is clients. The right solution might be to use Experience Edge, but often if clients haven't purchased that at the beginning when they've bought Content Hub, um, and they've got a requirement that needs content as a service from Content Hub, sometimes there's reluctance to make a purchase before kind of showing that value. Now, to stress that point, I really think that Experience Edge is the right solution for content as a service in Content Hub. There's the sort of Sitecore documentation listed here, and then an example from Nikki Vadera of building a blog using content as a service from CMP via Experience Edge with Sitecore. And there's another starter kit here that shows how you can work with Experience Edge to build a Next.js application in a similar way. But if you haven't got Experience Edge and you need that content to be exposed as an API, you can build your own, for example, a .NET Core API, and consume the Web Client SDK Nuget package, and effectively expose that content. Now, some of the benefits of that, I suppose, are it enables you to have a granular control of the API response, and I suppose with the Experience Edge endpoint, you need to use the out of the box syntax. So I'm sure there's some use cases where that's worthwhile, aside from just being constrained by not having Experience Edge available. It can be cost effective for a really simple use case. You can use memory cache to minimize requests back to Content Hub, and that's worth noting that there's kind of rating or limiting in the calling Content Hub. I think it's something like 15 requests per second, and so that memory cache minimizes the request that you're making. But that's another good feature of the Web Client SDK is it handles that rating and or metering, and it will pause to make requests less frequently if needed. And then additionally, if you're going to build an API, it facilitates network security requirements. And then I've mentioned the SDK taking care of the request limits. Now, additionally, you might want to build an API to ingest content to Content Hub. I think usually you'd probably use an Azure function for this purpose, but there's no reason that you couldn't use an API if you're more familiar with that paradigm. And then those endpoints can be called from any external system. And again, relating back to the memory cache, if you need to clear that memory cache, you can always use triggers with actions and post to an endpoint that's effectively going to clear your memory cache for the entity that has changed. Excuse me.
Okay, so as part of creating any sort of external integration, you'll need to authenticate with Content Hub. So again, looking at this Content Hub solution example repo, it shows in there how to go about creating a user using Postman to set the password. It's worth noting that the request URL is missing an S. Um, but yeah, effectively in Postman you can set that password, and then your external application is able to authenticate to Content Hub using username and password. But in order to do that, you also need to set up your OAuth client, and the instructions show how to do that, and it's reasonably simple. Um, there's different ways to authenticate with Content Hub. I think this is the most simple, but there's other ways if you need it to be perhaps more secure. Um, so how we'd then use that user in a OAuth password grant, and this is part of the SDK where we've got an iWebM client, and then using this OAuth password grant, passing in our Content Hub host along with the client ID and secret from the OAuth client we created on the previous slide, and then the username and password of the user we also created. And then you can see here we've got this M client factory that is creating your M client. And so I think that's quite straightforward to get up and running with. Okay, so bear with me, sorry. Okay, so let me just make sure. So querying with the Web Client SDK, you can see, and again, link to the documentation is very thorough. You can see here a really basic query with looking for where the definition name is M content. So you're basically looking for CMP entities with that condition there. And then we're selecting that entity using familiar link syntax for any .NET devs. And you're using various load configurations. There's this with relations property if you want to strim down. If you're not loading the full entity, you can specify the relations you're going to load, as well as the properties you're going to load. Excuse me. And then you can see this method here, the query async, which is on this querying client. And this will bring back by default 50 entities. So if you've got 1,000 entities out of the box, I believe it will only bring back 50. And there's a setting that you can change, but I'm sure there's a good scalability reason for not changing that. And you can see down the bottom, if you've got more than 50 entities that your query will return, it's recommended to use the entity iterator. And you can see here where the iterator is then using this while loop and this move next async to effectively batch the request to Content Hub for performance reasons. And then if you just want to bring back one entity, you can just use the single async method with that same query or similar query to bring back one entity. And it's worth noting that if you're getting a relation on a entity, that relation will just be a long or a numeric value. And so essentially that's where you would need to go back if you needed the full detail of that relation entity. You'd need to use this single async and go back and get that entity as a separate entity. So that's just worth noting around relations. Okay, so looking at function app examples, I think as I mentioned previously, I think that's a lot more of a common scenario for the for sort of
syncing data or importing data into Content Hub. But you can have these kind of service bus functions, and that could even be listening to Content Hub, or it could be listening to something else and then importing to Content Hub. And again, mentioning around how you can send these values through if you want whatever you need to do with your external Azure function. It may be the case that you then need to go back to Content Hub and get some more associated detail, and that's where you would consume the Web Client SDK within your Azure function, and be able to use that to go back and get the rest of the information or data that you need from Content Hub. And equally, a timer trigger, which is a super simple to implement. And again, this Nicky Vadera has got a blog, and he's using a timer trigger to ensure that if you're trying to integrate with an API from Content Hub, and that API needs you to authenticate with OAuth via a token, then what he's doing in this blog, I won't go too deep into it, but what he's doing is getting that token programmatically on a timer trigger, or refreshing that token programmatically, and then he's using the Web Client SDK to effectively go and update Content Hub with the correct OAuth token. And then that means that when your API from Content Hub is hitting this external API, it's always got the up-to-date token and then is successful as a result. Okay, so finally, the connector example. So obviously, this could be any connector. It could be in any platform. It could be any system. But the one I'm most familiar with, because it's out of the box, is the Sitecore Connect for Content Hub. And you can see this this flow here from the architecture diagram, where it's pushing a message to an Azure Service Bus topic using an action in Content Hub. That's then being listened to by the CMP connector within Sitecore, and that connector will then, based on some pipelines, which you can see these pipelines here, and all of those pipelines will be written in the Web Client SDK. So if you override them, if you want to add another processor to that pipeline, you would use the Web Client SDK, and that is then calling back to Content Hub using the API via the Web Client SDK in order to get the full detail of the entity, and it then writes that data to the database in Sitecore. So hopefully you kind of see how there's a lot of different ways you can use the Web Client SDK. I've gone through the internal integration with action scripts, and that is the same syntax. It is the same SDK that's being used in external integration. And I think I've shown examples of how you could use that in an API, how you could use that in an Azure function, or even in the case of if you're on Sitecore XM, for example, in .NET Framework, you can also use that.